Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to Bio 111. In this video, I'd like to go over a few things with you in Chapter 1, the study of life. In the video, I'd like to cover some of the main topics that's in the chapter, beginning with the characteristics of life, a little bit about evolution, classification of life, and the process of science, or really the scientific method. Now, we're going to start going through a few things here. One of the main things that I want you to really take note of as we go through the chapter and as we go through each of the chapters is to notice the vocabulary, because that's really what a big part of the course is about, is to learn and understand a lot of the vocabulary that you're going to be exposed to. And to really be successful in the course, you really need a good understanding of the vocab. I would suggest early on trying to find some way that works for you to really grasp and really study and learn vocab, a lot of the bold-faced words that are important, some of the things that I go over in the course and that are in the Connect Smart Book assignments and things. Really find some way that works for you. Many students that try and use just some regular old-fashioned handwritten flashcards, that really seems to work. There's something about writing down those words and really studying those in a handwritten fashion that really helps out a lot of students, or just having some kind of written vocab journal kind of by your side as you go through the video or as you go through some of the notes in the textbook or whatever, is to really concentrate on those on that vocab. And so we see here, of course, the word biology. Most of everybody is familiar with biology. The word literally means the study of life, and we're going to be going through the study of life, looking at a lot of diverse organisms throughout Bio 111, and then if you take Bio 112, you'll kind of continue with looking at diversity among living things. And so the question kind of becomes, what is a living thing? What really defines something that's living? And so that's pretty easy at the onset as you look around and you see plants and animals and people and your friends and all that. But sometimes when you see other types of things, bacteria, does that really qualify for a living organism? What about a virus? And everybody's now, of course, familiar with the coronavirus, the COVID, and now the monkeypox virus. You've probably heard about that on the news and things. And so, are viruses living? Do they have the same type of? Do they obey the same type of physical and chemical laws that other living organisms share? And so, we need to kind of look at some of those questions as well. Life is very diverse. There's many different examples of living organisms, and figure 1.1 here kind of shows us, a kind of a spectrum, I guess, of some living organisms. And maybe you can kind of look at these pictures and kind of see if anything kind of stands out about this spectrum. What are the similarities, or what are the differences in some of the things that you see? Starting in the far left, you see some bacteria. It doesn't look, maybe just on the onset, that it's alive, but it does have some basic, does share basic characteristics of all living things. And what about this paramecium? Maybe you've had a chance to look at some pond water under the microscope and seen some of the little microscopic living organisms that are there. If you hadn't had a chance to go to the Science Museum in Raleigh, you ought to take a look there. And they have some little research labs set up upstairs, and you can go in and they've got they've got some very nice microscopes there to kind of look at. Of course, you can go to the Nash campus there as well. And then you have some mushroom, example of a mushroom here. This is a morel type of mushroom here. And then, of course, plant life is located here, and then animal life is represented by here. So we're going to be looking at some of these main characteristics of living organisms, depending on which textbook that you look at. Usually biologists identify 5, 6, 7 different main characteristics that are shared by living things. And so number one we're going to look at is organization. Are you an organized person? Are you an organized student? Hopefully you are. That's, especially for your academic success, it's good to be organized. And so hopefully you'll learn some organizational skills as you go through the course as well. But in general, life is organized. Living things are organized. And so there is kind of a hierarchy or different levels of living things, but all the way down to the very smallest molecular part of living things, life is made up of atoms, just like everything else is. And then this is another good word here to add to your vocab list if you don't already know what a cell is. That's a basic unit of structure and function of all living things. In other words, if you look at the smallest part of an organism that is still alive, then that would be what's called a cell. And some organisms are just unicellular. They just only have one cell. Some organisms, most organisms, I guess we would think of, would be multicellular. By the way, as you're looking at vocabulary through the chapter and through the course, it's a good idea to start learning some prefixes, and that helps you understand what the word's telling you. Cellular, that's the root of the word, and that's telling you that it's made up of a cell, but uni means singular or means one. And so a unicellular organism just has a single cell, like a bacteria would. Multi means many. And so multicellular means it has multiple cells, at least more than one, but probably many, many cells. They estimate the human body has trillions of cells. And so I've seen different estimates on that, but trillions of cells in an average human body. And so as we're going to look at some of the organizational levels, each step up is like a ladder, and so each step up is a little more organized. And so, like I said, take a look sometime. It's kind of hard to see on the notes here, but take a look at figure 1.2 from the textbook. Kind of look at those individual levels of organization, beginning with the very smallest. That's the atom. There's a little chapter that deals a little bit with some basic chemistry. We'll look at that next. And one thing I meant to point out about chapter 1 is it does give you some of this background, but there's a lot of topics that chapter 1 is going to introduce that we're going to see in more detail as we go through the course. You combine atoms together and you form a molecule. And then eventually you work your way up to a cell. And again, this is the definition of the cell, the structure, the smallest part of a living organism, the structure and functional unit of a living organism. Now, the way this figure does, which is kind of nice, it starts out giving you kind of an example on the left side of maybe like an animal would have a nerve cell. You have nerve cells in your body. And then they give you kind of an example from a plant side of things. And so plants are made up of cells. They have individual cells as well. But what's beyond that? What happens when you have cells kind of grouping together, and that forms what's called a tissue? All right, a tissue's group of cells, they generally have a common structure and function. Now, there's 4 major tissues in humans, and so this is one category of the tissues that you would find in the human body, the nervous tissue. And these would be individual nerve cells or neurons here, and this is some kind of plant tissue here that you see on the right. And so so you've got cells kind of working together here. But what happens whenever you have tissues working together? And so that would be an organ. And so you put all these you put a collection of nerve tissues together, and that could form, the brain. And you put some leaf tissue together, and that would form the actual leaf for the plant. And then what do you get when you take all of the organs that are, in a similar, have a similar function? You put those together. So for example, if you think of the organs related to nerves and nervous tissue and neurons, you put those together, and that would form the nervous system for that organ. Eventually, you put all of the organ systems together, and you would have that organism. You would have that individual. And so generally, again, the human body would have, most scientists break those down into 11 main organ systems. Just kind of depends on how you categorize everything. Then even beyond that, you can kind of look at, okay, so that's the organism, but what happens, what do you have whenever you have a group of similar organisms that interbreed, all right, they interbreed, and so that would be called a species. Now, if you're talking about a group of those organisms that are living together, a single species living together, that would be called a population. So all of the um, individuals within that population would be the same species. They would be interbreeding. So in other words, I have a population of elephants. I don't have any other animals mixed in here. I've got a population of the same species. All these would be elephants. If we're dealing on the plant side of things, I could have a population of trees. We're still getting larger and larger on our level of organization up here. So what would happen whenever you included other populations within a general area? In other words, I probably have, I'm not going to have just elephants living on their own. There's going to be other groups of populations. And so maybe there's a population of zebras, or maybe there's a population of birds that live kind of right around this area, or population of certain trees, or population of certain grasses. And so all of those populations interacting and living in a general area, that creates a community. Now, what do you have whenever you mix in the physical or the non-living aspects of the of that community? That would be the ecosystem. And so now, and it's kind of hard to see the little picture up here now, but now you have the water. Even though the water has a living component inside of it, right? There's fish or bacteria or algae or whatever, but the water itself is non-living. Or the sunlight, or the wind, or the rain, or the soil. Even though the soil is going to have living aspects inside of it, but the soil itself is non-living, it's abiotic. And so if you add all those things to that community, you would have the ecosystem. And eventually, and I know it's really hard to see here, but eventually you would have basically everything that's living, that's part of is what's known as the biosphere. And so it doesn't matter if the life is located on the surface of the planet, the Earth's crust, if it's located in the water, or if it's located in the air above us, that's part of the biosphere. Now, all of these words are defined for you in the notes here. I'm not going to read over all the definitions again, but here they are for you. Again, I would suggest making a flashcard for these, and so that way you would have those handy, or writing those down in a separate journal somewhere. All right, so that's number one. Life is organized. Number two, life requires materials. You require certain materials. You require energy. You have to have ability to produce energy. Your definition of energy is the ability or capacity to do some kind of work. And it's required because you have a lot of life-sustaining processes that are taking place. Your body is essentially a chemical factory almost, and so you're always going through different types of chemical reactions. That word is that's a vocab word here, metabolism. All the different types of chemical reactions taking place inside the body, inside of your cells. That's called metabolism. Some chemical reactions are important to kind of build up and produce molecules. And then some chemical reactions are trying to break down certain molecules. And so we'll look at those as we go through. There's a whole chapter on metabolism and energy. Now, where are we getting all this energy from? Well, the ultimate source is the sun, because the sun is providing the energy for all the plants to absorb and to use. And that process is known as photosynthesis, and we're going to be going through that process a little later in the semester as well. When you look at ecosystems, I kind of mentioned that definition earlier, but when you look at ecosystems, they are basically characterized by different types of energy going through the system, different chemicals going through the system. In other words, you probably have heard about or read about like the water cycle, or the nitrogen cycle, or carbon dioxide, as it kind of cycles through there. And so there's another chapter that we're going to deal with energy and kind of how it flows through a particular ecosystem, but it all begins with the energy from the sun as it goes to the plants. And then you have the food chain that kind of begins there as the plants, as primary producers, they absorb and they produce energy, they produce the food. And then, an herbivore, something comes along and eats the plants to get energy for their body. And then you may have a carnivore eating that herbivore to get energy for its body. And so, but all begins with the energy from the sun. And this figure 1.4 kind of shows kind of some of that energy cycle that's taking place there. All right, so life is organized. Life requires energy. Life has a balance, and that's homeostasis. An equilibrium, if you want to call it that. Homeostasis is maintaining certain types of internal conditions. And you and I have many of these types of processes taking place in our bodies as well. And so you can think of homeostasis as a balance or equilibrium. I always give the example of like your thermostat. Maybe in your house, if it's your body tries to balance. In fact, your body does this as well. It has an internal temperature balance regulation as well. Your set temperature is somewhere around 98.6 degrees. It fluctuates up and down during the day, but that's kind of your set body temperature. And you have different things in the body that try to balance keep your temperature close to that homeostasis set point. And so it's very important to be able to adapt and to kind of have that balance. Living organisms react or respond to the environment, and we need to be able to respond, and that way we can better adjust to whatever conditions there are. And so many times you'll notice that the living organism will not just respond but also will move. So think about if somebody shines a bright light in your eyes, what's going to happen? Well, you're probably going to close your eyes, or your pupils may change, or kind of get smaller there and constrict, that sort of thing. Or if you touch something that's hot, that's a stimulus, and you're going to respond by probably moving your hand back from that hot surface. And so that's a response in the environment. Living organisms generally respond to the environment. Plants, they respond to the environment. And you think, well, where are they going to move to? Well, if you think, if you have some house plants, maybe they have a response to sunlight. And so many times they will kind of move a little closer to a sunny area, and the plant stem kind of leans over to that area just a little bit to kind of get more of that sunlight. Some plants will kind of close their leaves a little bit if it's in a drought condition, or if as the rainfall kind of slows down, they'll kind of close their leaves out a little bit. All organisms, living organisms, must be able to reproduce and develop. That sounds kind of common sense, and it really is, because what's going to happen if organisms don't are not able to, or for whatever reason don't successfully reproduce and pass on their traits or genes to the next generation? Eventually they're going to be their population is going to be endangered, or perhaps even go extinct. And so living organisms must be able to reproduce in a manner that allows their copies of their genetic information or genes to pass on to the next generation. We're going to go over this more as we get closer to genetics. We'll have a unit that deals with classical Mendelian type genetics and human genetics a little later on. We also have some molecular biology, so we'll be talking about the genetic information, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And the last main characteristic we're going to talk about are adaptations. Living organisms generally have adaptations to allow them to better survive or function in a particular environment, whether it's a hot condition, or a dry condition, or a very cold condition, or very wet environment. And so generally they have the ability to make some kind of change over time. There's another bold-faced word to look at, and the evolution is change in a population of organisms over time to become more suited to that particular condition or environment. All right, and so section 2 just kind of introduces you to the evolution and classification of life. We're mainly going to talk about classification here. There's a whole another unit eventually about the theory of evolution. We'll look at that as we go through. One of the things we'll mention here is natural selection. This is a mechanism based on that was proposed by Charles Darwin that says that some of the aspects of the environment help to select which traits seem to be more apt to be passed on to the next generation. The idea is that individuals that have good traits, helpful traits, or favorable traits will have the better chances to survive. And they'll produce the best the greatest number of offspring that will have the best traits, and they will be the ones to survive. If they survive, then they will increase their frequency and the frequency of those favorable traits in that particular population. Mutations, genetic mutations, the change of the DNA sequence here actually help fuel the process of natural selection. Your textbook in figure 1.6 kind of gives a little simple illustration here of natural selection. Let's say you have a some kind of animal here, deer here, that is feeding on a population of leaves, but he prefers to have these little smooth. You've got some leaves that are smooth and some that have these little hair extensions out there. I don't know if these are trichomes or little bristles attached to the leaf, but this this deer likes to eat the soft ones or the smooth ones more, and so eventually there's going to be fewer and fewer of those smooth ones. And you'll have more of these hairy ones left over. And so this is a natural way that selection could take place. You've basically decreased over time the number of these smooth type of leaves because they have been kind of eaten a lot, and then you've increased the frequency of the ones with the hairs. So that's a type of natural selection. Artificial selection has been going on as well. Farmers have been artificially selecting for desirable traits for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. That's why we have so many different types or breeds, not breeds, but varieties of tomato plants or corn, because you select for the ones that are best, have the best traits. The biggest crop yields, or the biggest or the tastiest tomato that you like. And so that's a type of artificial selection. We'll eventually talk about kind of the tree of life, evolutionary tree of life. And it's kind of like looking at the family tree. If you've ever done any genealogy in your family. And so you've kind of looked at kind of a family tree. And so this is kind of the family tree of life. And you can kind of see the 5 major groups here of living organisms: animals, fungi, plants, protists, and then 2 prokaryotic groups. We'll talk about that word later: archaea and bacteria. Now, those are the characteristics of living things. One other topic that we want to look at here in this section is organizing all of this diversity that we've been kind of talking about. And like I said, it's good to be organized. And so all these different living things need to have some kind of naming system and a way to kind of keep things classified into different categories. And so the study of all that, there's a whole discipline or whole area of biology that's job is to try to identify and classify, categorize, name species, organisms, and that is called taxonomy. And so that's a big area of work. Not everything has been named. Not everything has a correct name. And so especially with the advent of molecular tools, molecular biology, DNA, RNA work, these things allow for scientists to have a better understanding of how things are really related, and they continue to try to name or rename or reclassify, recategorize different examples of living organisms. That's taxonomy. If you're looking at how organisms are related to each other, that's kind of an area known as systematics. In other words, you're looking at the family tree again. That would be systematics. And so there's a series of ways to categorize living organisms. They're kind of listed out here for you: species, That's probably the most familiar to us. The species level. You have a species of bird or species of plant, species of tree, the genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, supergroup, a relatively new group there, and then also domain. This table does a good job. It kind of gives you all of those categories listed out for you, and then gives you the name of which we would fall into. So you may be familiar with our species name, which is Homo sapiens. That's the species name for humans. But we also fall into the genus called Homo. We fall into the family called Hominidae, and the order primates, class Mammalia, phylum Chordata, kingdom Animalia, the supergroup Opisthoconta, and then the domain is Eukarya. So this is how you would categorize or classify humans. And then you've got a plant example here. And so you can see kind of how that works for the corn group. At the very top here of the categories on the level of classification, you have domain, and there's three main domains here, two of which are known as prokaryotic. They lack a membrane-bound nucleus, and they lack membrane-bound organelles. We're going to get into that as we get into our cell biology unit. And so these have some similarities there, but that includes bacteria. Bacteria are your prokaryotic type organisms. And then everything else falls into the eukarya. These are eukaryotic organisms or eukaryotes. We'll see that definition more as we go through, but these have a membrane-bound nucleus and other membrane-bound type organelles in the cell. Then a couple of examples here. The domain Archaea is listed here. It's a type of bacteria. They're prokaryotes, very adapted to very extreme type environments, high temperatures, kind of acidic conditions, different extreme areas there. Here's your bacteria, if you're familiar with E. coli bacteria or salmonella type bacteria. Lactobacillus, that's a good type of what we think of as a good type of bacteria that you find in things like yogurt. Lactobacillus is very helpful for the body. And so many different examples of bacteria. And then, of course, eukarya, everything else, but that includes protists, like those protozoan that I mentioned earlier. It includes plants, it includes fungi, and includes the animal group. And then kind of last couple things here. The scientific name is based in Latin, and it's what's known as binomial nomenclature. It's a fancy way of saying it has two parts to its name. Nomenclature is name. Binomial means it has two names. And so it has a two-part name. And so that first part is the genus. And so for humans, it's Homo. That's the genus here. And then sapiens is the species name. And they kind of give you a little bit of the semantics there. You always capitalize the genus there, and the second word, the species, always written in lowercase. And if you see this typed, it's always going to be italicized. And so Homo sapiens or Zea maize is corn. Now in this section 1.3 of the chapter, we're going to talk about something that we've probably all used before. You may not realize it, but we're going to talk about the scientific method. This is essentially, you can see the definition there, standard series of steps used in gaining new knowledge through research. It sounds very complicated, but like I said, we've all done this before if you've ever had to solve any kind of problem. Now, scientists use this, and generally you'll see different kind of step-by-step methods, and we see here mainly 5 steps to the scientific method. But think about a recent, maybe a scenario, situation, some kind of problem that you may have experienced that you've tried to solve on your own. Maybe maybe go out to go on a trip somewhere, and your car doesn't start. And so think of those types of scenarios as systematic processes that you go through to try to figure out what's going on with your car. Why won't it start? You probably make some kind of observation. You try to maybe look to find out, what the problem is. You may even make a hypothesis, an educated guess. Maybe, what doesn't start because the battery's dead, or maybe it doesn't start because, you're out of gas, or whatever the case is. You may even make some predictions or experiments. You may, go and check the battery if you know a little bit about cars. You may go check a few things on it, and then you may even collect some data from those experiments. Or if you're, familiar with the battery, you could, test it out with a multimeter, look at a voltmeter, see if you've got some voltage there, or whatever, and maybe actually collect some data. And then you can make some results. Is the conclusion that you come up with it, what did you determine? Is it the battery or not? And then many times you may have to go back and say, okay, well, maybe it wasn't the battery, but I need to kind of go back and look at, maybe there's another hypothesis, or maybe even I need to go back and look at some more items that it could be, make some more observations and kind of start the process over. So the scientific method is not just for science. We use it on a day-to-day basis, but it is a good way to try to learn more about a particular situation or problem. So let's look at some of these steps again. Observation. Scientists use different senses, looking at things, or gathering some type of information about whatever situation or whatever they're trying to study. They form a hypothesis, some type of educated guess, like I said before, or technically a tentative explanation for what kind of matches their observations there. And then the hypothesis should be testable. It needs to be testable, because that's kind of the next step, is to kind of create an experiment based on that hypothesis. If your hypothesis that you have is not, you're not able to test it, then it really doesn't serve a valid purpose. So now let's say you've collected some observations, you've formulated some type of hypothesis, some type of explanation for your observations that you're looking at. Now the next thing to do is to try to create some experiments around that hypothesis. Generally, you use deductive reasoning to try to make that educated guess and try to anticipate an expected outcome. You should have a good experimental design, a design that can be repeated independently. In other words, you should be able to test your hypothesis on your own, and then someone else, and maybe another group or another research group can use your methods and come up with the same conclusion. A little bit about the variables here. It says a good experimental design ensures the scientist is examining the contribution of a specific variable. That's the one that you're trying to test. That's the experimental, or also known as the independent variable. That's what you're trying to really look at and look for changes. You'll also have, a lot of times, you'll have some type of control variable, something that doesn't change, and then you want to make sure that that is regulated in your experiment. And that's kind of here on this next slide. A test group, that's going to be what you're using for your what you're exposing to the experimental variable. Maybe you have, maybe you're working with plants, and you've got a group of plants as your test plants, and you're taking that variable. Maybe that variable could be exposure to light, or exposure to nutrients, or exposure to how much water they need, or whatever. And so you're going to take a group of plants, that would be your test group, your test subject, and expose them to whatever variable that you decide to test. But then also you'll have to have a control group. The control group has to have the same type of experiment, but it's not going to be exposed to that variable that you're trying to change and experiment with. Of course, you need to collect data based on these experiments. A lot of times, scientific research is going to use statistics that will try to, analyze the data in a very scientific type format. A lot of times, you're looking for how much change there is in the variables that you're looking at, so some kind of measure variation. A lot of times, you need to know what's called a standard error. How close are you to what you predicted, or really how far off was your data based on what you thought it was going to be. And you need to make sure your data has some type of statistical significance associated with it so that it is reliable. And a lot of times you'll see probability implied. If you take a statistics class, you'll talk about the p-value. And as long as you kind of set your p-value less than 5%, that's generally the accepted percentage there. That kind of gives you your confidence rate. In other words, you're 95% confident that your data that you have is actually explaining the results, and that there's only a 5% or less than 5% that your data is incorrect, that maybe your data is just due to some kind of chance event or randomized event. And then, of course, with scientific research, you would have to report your conclusions. You need to kind of look at your hypothesis, look at the data. Data then would be interpreted to determine whether or not you can support or reject your hypothesis. And so if what you predicted comes true, if what you predicted is successful, then you can, if your data supports your hypothesis, then you can establish that your hypothesis is truly supported. If not, your hypothesis should then be rejected, and then you would, maybe revisit it, maybe go back and look at some other observations, or maybe revise your hypothesis based on some of these conclusions. And generally, scientists would report their findings to other labs, maybe some scientific journals. These would be reviewed by peers, other colleagues in the area in that discipline. And many times those other scientists may try to, use that finding to try to duplicate what they established in their own lab, and to make sure that, again, these experiments should be repeatable if performed in a similar setting. Now, last couple things here is to know the difference between a scientific theory versus a scientific principle or law. A theory generally describes some scientific concepts that kind of come together, that are well supported, and they seem to be supported by a broad range of observations, experiments, and data. Are they 100% true? Well, no, they're not necessarily a principle or law. They do seem to have an ample amount of support, but they're still considered to be a theory. Whereas a scientific principle or law really doesn't have any challenge to the criteria or to the validity of that principle. All right, the last little section here, I just want to mention a few things about it, just a couple of vocab words again that I think you should be aware of. Of course, we've been talking a little bit about science, how that's really a systematic way of understanding things going on in the natural world. And of course, you'd want to have some type of systematic study like the scientific process. By the way, you're going to be using the scientific method a lot during our lab time, and you'll be completing a lot of virtual type simulations, and they're based upon the scientific method. And so you'll kind of get a good hands-on aspect for that. Technology, of course, is the application of a lot of scientific knowledge to basically what our interests are. And so, think about on a daily basis how much technology you interact with, how much technology you have just in your world alone, whether it's your cell phone, the apps, whether it's technology in a car or vehicle, or maybe you have a hybrid vehicle, or a battery operated vehicle, or in the computers or Chromebooks or tablets, all these different electronic devices. Technology is all around us. In the healthcare area, technology is there to help with development of new medicines, new drugs, and so new therapies is all around us. And so technology, of course, is critical. A couple other things here in this section. Climate change. Everybody's been hearing about this, of course, and that's referring to changes in the normal cycles of Earth's climate. There are normal cycles in the climate. You can go back and look at studies of how the Earth's climate has changed over hundreds and even thousands of years. There's always warm periods and there are always cold periods that kind of cycle through in and out. And a lot of that has to do with the carbon cycle. As carbon gets kind of released into the atmosphere, that tends to kind of envelop the atmosphere and a little bit more CO2, and that creates some increase of temperatures. And then there are times when that carbon gets more trapped in the Earth's surface and in the water, and that creates a decrease in the carbon. That causes things to get colder than normal. So climate does change, and it does change kind of on a very wide fluctuation. Biodiversity. That's very important when we study biology, and we'll see these things again as we go through. Again, chapter 1 is just an introductory type chapter, but biodiversity is kind of looking at how many and how abundant a species is in a particular area. How there's also genetic biodiversity. How diverse are the genes among those species in that particular ecosystem in which they live? And so scientists, biologists generally estimate, I'm not sure exactly how they know this, but they estimate there may be around 8.7 million different species. And they, to date, have named somewhere around 2.3 million of those species. So think about that. There's over 6 million species that have not been identified or maybe still need to be named. So biodiversity is really huge. And then extinction, of course, everybody knows extinction is the death of the last member of a species. That's just kind of your book definition there, or larger classification category. And so they estimate that hundreds of species every year go extinct and that are not able to be preserved. And so sometime you can kind of Google that and take a look and see, how many different species are on the endangered species list. There are some success stories as well. Some species that have been on the endangered species list and have really been, based on different efforts in either captivity or different areas in the wild, also are able to get those numbers back much higher. Ecosystems in danger. That's ongoing. Tropical rainforest, coral reef ecosystems. They are very important in the ecosystem. Tropical rainforests, the jungles, and then coral reef. They generally have a lot of biodiversity there, but based on different studies, they seem to be very much threatened by human activities into that area. Whether it's deforestation, cutting down the rainforest, or chemicals, or other problems going into the water that's causing problems with the reef systems and things like that. Definitely have some issues there. The tropical rainforest, of course, huge areas for plant life, insects, and then many other animals there as well. Coral reefs, habitats for jellyfish, marine and sponges are there, crabs, lobsters, all kinds of sea animals, sea life, and fish, of course. And the last thing I kind of want to mention here, destruction of healthy ecosystems has unintended effects. Nobody wants these ecosystems to suffer. And so, we depend on these for a lot of things. I mean, obviously, we depend on healthy ecosystems for the food that we eat. Many times they find new chemicals or new medicines especially in the plant areas. There's scientists that research plants and look at the chemicals inside the plants and have the ability to kind of extract different medicines and formulas out of the plants. Draining of the wetlands, even closer to home, like in Mississippi and Ohio rivers, not that far away. Draining wetlands is a problem, has been a problem, even closer than those areas, like in the Wilmington area that has a lot of wetland area. If you're familiar with the coastal area of North Carolina, anytime you drain the wetlands, you run the risk of causing problems with flooding and causing problems with farmlands and things like that. cutting down the rainforest, obviously that's going to be detrimental to the species that need to live there. And then eventually they're exhausting their own natural resource of lumber. So, you know, so there's many organizations that are trying to help in these areas. There's tons of stuff that needs to be done to try to help, you know, protect these very vulnerable ecosystems because we depend on them. We depend on the the ecosystems just like the natural species that live in those areas do.